All right. We are finishing up lesson 13. Lesson 13 in our study book, The Work of the Church as it pertains to benevolence. We've talked about evangelism. We've talked about encouragement, edification. Now we're talking about benevolence. And as we ended last week, we noted some of the points that Brother Cogdell brings up. It should be remembered that in none of these examples did any church set up a benevolent society or institution to care for the needy. It was done under the elders of each church. And then number 3, no church contributed to another church to enable it to promote and carry on a good work. They sent only when the church was in need, such as the needy saints in Judea because of the famine in Acts chapter 12, and then again later on regarding 1 Corinthians 16 regarding the needy saints in Jerusalem. No church handled the money of any church or became the messenger of any other church. It was sent directly via oversight. There was kind of a chain of possession, chain of authority, of oversight that was contained with that. And then number 5, these examples constitute the pattern for benevolent work among the churches of Christ. He ends here with this kind of the conclusion that these examples of how New Testament churches did their benevolent work do not constitute a pattern or model for churches today in doing their benevolent work. Then there is no such thing as a pattern for anything in the New Testament. And we're left free to worship, organize, and work according to our own will, and the New Testament examples have no meaning. So going into the questions, we talked about question 1. That's about as far as we got in terms of our questions. Some argue that Jesus' example of feeding the multitudes authorizes the church to offer benevolence as a method to promote evangelism. What does John 6 indicate about this? And as we discussed, first of all, the church hasn't been established. Okay, that's one thing to note. What's happening here is not an organization. Okay, it was Jesus doing this. His purpose for doing it had, I would say, first of all, obviously there's going to be a miracle to be done. That miracle is going to show forth the fact that he really truly was sent from God, being able to do something that was miraculous in nature. It's going to confirm the things that he was saying, which is part of the reasons for miracles. And certainly there is verse 5, and of course in the other examples as well, of recognizing that he had compassion on the multitude. In fact, throughout the Gospels, when Jesus would speak to a multitude or he would do a miracle, Jesus had compassion on the multitudes. But what we find the miracle taking place here in chapter 6 up through verse 15. And then verse 16, we have the situation where there's a storm on the Sea of Galilee, and then Jesus walks on the water. And then in verse 22 of John chapter 6, on the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except that one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats came from Tiberias, near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. But when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Now notice what Jesus says in verse 26. Okay, Jesus speaks to what their mind is, what their heart is, why they were all congregating there on the side, why they all came over the sea to get to Jesus. Most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, that was the feeding of the 5,000 with the loaves and the fishes, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. And so this kind of creates a whole situation in verse 28. They respond, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? Jesus says, this is the work of God, if you believe in him on whom he sent. In other words, Jesus as the Messiah. They said, what sign will you perform then? Jesus, and of course, verse 31, our fathers ate the manna in the desert. It is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. What's the implication there? Yeah, give us more food. He did that yesterday. I did that for you yesterday. Okay, and that's the point that Jesus makes. I mean, he did do that for them yesterday, but it was for a purpose of showing his power. And so they ask again, what work will you do to prove this? Hey, God gave our fathers manna. Won't you give us manna or bread or something to eat? And so in Jesus' response, verse 32, I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And then Jesus goes on to describe how that in order to have this bread, you have to eat of my flesh. In order to have everlasting life, you have to drink of my blood, and so forth. And certainly being one in Christ Jesus, being that implication, there's obviously a connection to the Lord's Supper as well there. But they don't understand that. And it's a hard thing for them to figure out. In fact, in verse 41, the Jews complain because it says, I am the bread which came down from heaven. And then they also complain in verse 52, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And so in verse 60 and 61, they say, how, this is a hard saying, who can understand it? And many of them, verse 66, refuse to walk with them anymore. But the point certainly shows that despite the fact that these people were fed, as soon as Jesus indicated he wasn't going to do that, and instead his message was a spiritual one, they didn't seem to have a lot of interest in that. And that's part of the point that Brother Cogdell is kind of bringing out in the lesson. First of all, what Jesus does in chapter 6 is not indicative or precedent for authority of the church as a whole to kind of open up as a means to serve the community in food or any other way. But there was a broader reason why Jesus did what he did. And certainly Jesus did miracles to prove he was who he said he was. We aren't able to do those miracles, much less, again, as an organization, we're not given that authority. Jesus, as an individual, had the authority to use the power of the Father to prove who he was, which Jesus did. The apostles did it to prove the power of God and to prove the words that they said were from God. However, we are supposed to speak the truth. We're supposed to preach the gospel, and it's not authorized for us to offer, quote-unquote, benevolence, however broadly that applies, in an effort to get people in so that we can then try to teach them. John 6 shows that that's not going to work. Any thoughts or comments through question 1?
How could they see a miracle and not be amazed to the point like us? Is that because there's no more miracles today, and a miracle today would just blow us away? To them, do they see enough miracles and to not appreciate them for what they are?
I tend to think that it was too subtle of a miracle. Okay, I tend to think that they're expecting some big, lightning, thunder, something really major, something, very demonstrative. And yet what they got was somehow these loaves and fishes multiplied themselves. Okay, I think it was too subtle for them to, and not that it would have mattered. I mean, remember when Jesus was on the cross, what did they say? We'll believe in you if you come down off the cross. Okay, come on, use your power. Show us your power. We'll believe in you. Do you really think they would have? No, they'd have tried to stick them back up there. Okay, so in the end, no amount of signs is going to change anything. But the fact of the matter was, Jesus did show a sign in doing the miracle of the feeding of the multitude. But that didn't really, for them, that wasn't enough. It didn't really register in their mind as that really counting as anything. I think they were looking for something bigger and better and more awesome to see or whatnot. And even if Jesus had done that, would that necessarily have caused them to believe? No.
I mean, it's the Jews' nature all the way back to crossing the Red Sea.
Yeah.
I mean, they were short-sighted or had a weak mind or something.
Well, and Jesus.
How
Oh yeah. How quickly you forget. Yeah.
How much does it take?
Yeah. Well, and often.
Or were they just a doubting people?
And Jesus often said that A vile and perverse generation seeks a sign, and the Jews sought signs. Paul even referenced the fact that Jews always were seeking signs. Okay, so it didn't matter how many signs you delivered, they're always seeking the next one. And maybe even in the case of John 6, how can I benefit from the next one? What have you done for me lately? And that lately is a very, very short-term memory, as was the case with Israel. Carissa? Yeah. Yeah. Short-sighted, short memory, quick to forget the lessons maybe that you learned one day, and then the very next day you forget, as is the case or should have been the case in John 6. They should have remembered Jesus feeding them, but they're instant gratification. Yeah. 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 That's a human nature type of thing. Yeah. All right. Anything else to question one? Yeah. Well, and that.
You believe the gospel and want to do exactly what it says, and you have to be able to conviction every day to do that.
Well, that brings up a great example.
Far away to a degree, but
Yeah.
conviction is what it's all about. You're in or out.
Yeah. Well, the parable of the sower, right? I mean, there was some. It wasn't just the seed that was planted in the fertile ground that grew. There was also some that was planted among the stones in the stony ground, and it grew. It caught root, but when trials came or tribulations came, what happened to that particular plant? It didn't have any foundation, so it fell over. And a lot of times when we read the parable of the sower, we get the implication that, well, only the individuals in whom had a fertile heart, they were the only ones who became Christians. But that's not true. You have the example of the seed that was sown in the stony heart that took root for a moment. But as soon as tribulation or adversity came along, they just kind of fall over. And certainly having that conviction speaks to the root, to having that foundation being established. It doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter, what's taking place. I'm still going to be convicted no matter what. And certainly regarding this multitude back in John 6, I don't think it speaks very much to any conviction that certainly, and as we've noticed already, John chapter 3, you've got Cornelius who had difficulty understanding the difference between the physical and the spiritual. John chapter 4, you've got the woman at the well who had issues understanding the physical versus the spiritual. And then here in John chapter 6, you've got individuals who struggled over the lesson that Jesus was making about eating of my flesh, physical versus spiritual. So John makes a very clear and emphatic point about the struggles and the difficulties of people overcoming the physical stumbling blocks to understand the spiritual lessons. So by a church offering benevolence in forms of food or money to get people in here, what are we in essence encouraging? Look at the physical stuff. And that's the very reason why John brings up the examples that he does, is to show that these things are a stumbling block. These things hinder people from learning the truth. It doesn't help them to learn the truth, because it's only going to continue. Their interest is only going to continue as long as the benevolence continues. And as soon as that stops or wavers in some form or fashion, they're not going to be as interested. What have you done for me today? Anything else to question? Question 2. Explain how the context of Galatians 6 and James 1 demonstrate that these apply to individuals rather than church action. Certainly Galatians 6 and verse 10, let us not grow weary in doing good. And certainly as he goes on, especially to the household of God. Okay. Then in James chapter 1 and verse 27, talking about true and undefiled religion is to visit widows and orphans and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. All right. What within those contexts show that we're talking about individuals and not an organization or church? Yeah. Galatians. Yep. That's Galatians 6. It's individual. Okay, it's individual. James 1, be a doer of the work. Okay, he who looks into the mirror, he describes that. This one's religion, okay, the concept of this person, to keep oneself unspotted from the world, speaking to an individual's heart and soul. Does a church have a soul? Does it have its own unique entities, self-identity? No, it's made up of individuals. Okay, it's speaking to that soul, or being unspotted from the world, speaks directly to whether or not that person's living faithfully and obediently to the Lord. And those contexts certainly are borne out in 1 Timothy chapter 5, which leads us to question 3. Discuss and summarize the instructions in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 through 16. We don't have to go through all of it, but it's important to point out that even within the direction of benevolence to widows, what are some of the requirements for a church to take into a daily distribution, or weekly or monthly, to support her fully? What does that woman have to be? What's the very first thing she has to be? Okay, well, she has to be a Christian. She has to be at least 60 years old. Okay, what else? A widow, indeed. Okay, not just a widow, but a widow indeed. Not just has her husband passed away, but she doesn't have any family to take care of her. Now, if Paul describes those restrictions on someone who is a Christian, okay, why would that be the case regarding a widow indeed, and yet there are no restrictions for people in the community? That seems a little backwards, doesn't it? And so, understanding the instructions of 1 Timothy 5, especially as Paul summarizes in verse 15 and 16, that let a family take care of this widow, let not the church be burdened. Okay, the individual has that responsibility. And it doesn't just speak to the difference between an individual and a church, it speaks to responsibility as well. And the church has certain responsibilities that it is commanded to meet. The individual has certain responsibilities that they're commanded to meet. And those two are not interchangeable. Okay? There are separate commands at times for congregation of God's people, and restrictions as a part of that, versus an individual. All right. Anything else through? And of course, the last part of this question: if only qualified widows may receive regular support, is the church authorized to extend general benevolence to unbelievers? Do we have authority? Is there any place in the New Testament where the church extended benevolence, okay, which is specifically from the church funds primarily, to someone who wasn't a Christian? Yeah. See, and I think there was an opportunity there. Yeah, in Acts 3, Peter says, "Gold and silver have I none." Okay, and to be fair, it's, Peter very likely, maybe he didn't have any gold and silver on him. Okay, but the point made there is the fact that certainly if that was of a situation that was important, Peter could have said, "But you know what? The brethren here have been selling what they have, and they've been, taking care of each other. If you go down here to the corner and talk to brother so and so, I'm sure he'll set you up, and get you some gold and silver." That's not what Peter said. What I do have to give you, that which Peter was authorized to give him, he did give him, and that was certainly the healing, and of course attached to that is the confirmation and teaching of the word, which happened in Acts 3. Anything else through question 3? All right, let's move on to lesson 14. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on lesson 14. I've got a couple things highlighted here, but I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on lesson 14, mainly because lesson 14 is kind of a culmination of some of the points that he's already made in past lessons. But there are a couple things that he brings out that are kind of unique to lesson 14. The problems of congregational cooperation. So reading the introduction here, there are 3 solutions to the problem of congregational cooperation that are being offered to the churches of Christ. They need careful study and consideration in the light of Bible teaching without any of the false issues and prejudices that have so commonly been aroused, if a scriptural solution to the problem is to be found. Only the will of God can determine what is right and wrong on the question, and God's will can be learned only through a study of His Word. There should be complete unanimity of purpose, and all the issues in this problem, whatever they are, shall be resolved in the light of divine truth. Every effort shall be made in the interest of truth, and from such a course we should not allow our minds to be diverted. What saith the Lord? That is the solution to the problem if we are to please God. So the first, he's going to talk about problems regarding, issues regarding church congregational cooperation between churches, and some of the issues that are being faced with that, some of the, I guess you say, arguments against it to show that this is something that isn't supported by Scripture. And the first point he brings up is the problem cannot be resolved by false standards. And by false standards, one of the points that he makes here, the problem cannot be resolved by the amount of good we may think a particular project is doing. To say good work, and we've mentioned this before, the phrase good work is used all the time in the religious society. But it's defined by them as to what a good work is, rather than letting it be defined by God. And unfortunately, the concept of benevolence in a very broad definition is linked to good works. And so as a result, because the intention is good, because it's good, it's humanitarian. A lot of times humanitarian is kind of subletted into a benevolence or the concept of doing good works. Okay, even sometimes so much as having proper manners and being polite, that sort of thing even gets incorporated into good works, quote unquote, for the church. The problem cannot be resolved by the amount of good we may think a particular project is doing. The standard isn't, well, how much good is coming from it? Well, how do you define good? Well, it's not just qualified by how much teaching is being done. The religious world, they don't restrain it to just how much teaching is being done or how much teaching are people retaining. How many people are being, quote unquote, saved. That's not how they measure that. They measure it by kind of their own determination of, well, we think this is doing a lot of good, or it has the potential good. And I think that that's a very important point. Engaging, under number 3 here, engaging in unscriptural worship is sometimes justified for the reason that it is uplifting and inspiring and, quote unquote, does good. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's involved in benevolence or institutions or worship, anything must be in harmony with the will of God and pleasing to Him in order to be good. God defines what's good. Remember, there are 2 terms in the New Testament for good. One is kalos, that's that which is beautiful because it's inherently of God. God has said, this is what I want you to do. Therefore, it's beautiful. The other term, agathos, is that which is beneficial. And we're not talking about either or, we're talking about the 2 together oftentimes. Certain things will be good because it's beneficial to others. It has a set benefit, or we can seek to be a benefit to other people. But no matter what, if something is good, even if it's beneficial, it's still beautiful because God says so. Because God has determined it's good. And so this is, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. Are we introduced to the concept of that which is good? After everything God created, what did He see? It was good. Okay? And so looking at God's definition of good is the key component here. Any point through A. B, the fact that we may have practiced a thing for years or even for generations does not justify it in God's sight. And I think that's a great point to bring up, especially as it pertains to looking at what the Scriptures say versus the traditions of men. Okay, I've mentioned before that years ago I remember somebody telling me about the church that they grew up in. They used to have a sheet over the vessels of the Lord's Supper, okay, over the trays. And back in the late 90s or so, somebody decided to take the sheet off. And many in the congregation got in a huge fuss. You can't take the sheet off. Why not? Well, we've always had the sheet on there. And well, why? Why have we always had the sheet on it? Nobody could remember, so they asked the oldest fellow in the congregation. He said, oh, when I was a boy, we didn't have air conditioning. The sheet was to keep the flies off the bread and the fruit of the vine. that was just there for expediency's sake. It wasn't there because the scriptures teach it. And that's a great example, and certainly with regard to, something that's an expedient, and yet all of a sudden you stop using that expedient. Well, that's wrong. You can't do it that way or not do it that way. And the fact of the matter is, just because something's been ingrained into our consciousness, into our mind, doesn't necessarily make it right. And we have to be just as careful of that as anyone, to make sure that just because, we have a certain order to services, but as long as we make clear to everybody, can we actually change that order? Yeah. As long as it's still being done decently and in order, and we make clear this is what to expect so nobody's confused, we can change that order. God doesn't restrict us to a certain set, song, prayer song, sermon song, invitation song, Lord's Supper song, whatever. He doesn't hold us to that, but we can do it in different ways. Anything through B. Under C, it has been approved by great and wise men in the church. This is not necessarily something you may hear often, but especially back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, this was a big deal. In fact, a lot of the writings from some of the preachers and so forth, even going back into the 1800s, there was a man, I've mentioned him before, a preacher by the name of Benjamin Franklin. He often referred to this argument, going back into the 300s and 400s AD, of the discussion regarding Catholicism. Well, this has been done for generations, and great and wise and well-taught men, this is what they say we should do. And they appealed to that authority, which would be more of a man's authority, as opposed to what God says. And that's the key component there. Well, is it possible for great and wise men to be wrong? Who? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, but that still applies to that kind of their own wisdom, right? That's their own wisdom that they're putting in there. The wisest man who ever lived did he make mistakes? Yeah, he did. Even within the church, sometimes certain preachers who've been around for ages and ages, and they're exalted very highly. Their influence is great among people. Even if they teach something wrong, there are people who will go right over the edge with them because brother so-and-so can't be wrong. He's taught so much for so many years and helped save so many people. He can't be wrong on this. But what did Paul say? Even Paul, an apostle, what did he say in Galatians 1? If we are an angel from heaven, teach anything different. Not just a preacher that is well known and his name is known around the church in the world or in America or whatnot. It's even the apostles. If they taught anything different, let them be accursed. So just because somebody is great and wise, maybe they've been around a long time, have a lot of experience, have taught a lot of good things, that doesn't mean they're exempt from making mistakes, or for that matter, falling off an edge there of teaching something that isn't right. Doug?
I just thought of an example. Our whole favorite was one of them.
Yeah.
When you were saying that, this came to mind.
Yep.
So many people respected him so much that he could do no wrong.
Yeah.
So that just fits the perfect example.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The teaching on the married and divorced who come to the Lord, and then his book on hell, that hell doesn't exist, it's just a state of non-existence. Certainly, both of those aspects, there are people who still defend that. He can't be wrong on that. He's so well taught and so well learned, he can't be wrong. Well, yeah, he can. All right, anything else through C? Under D, it is no more wrong to do a thing, even though it may be done in the wrong way, than it is to do nothing at all. Which is kind of like a false equivalency. It's no more wrong to do something, even though it may be done in the wrong way, than to do nothing at all. So, since it doesn't really matter, then what difference does it make? And the point that he makes here, evil cannot be compared or classified. The sin of omission is just as evil in the sight of God as the sin of commission, and the reverse is also true. He brings up zeal without knowledge is certainly not pleasing to God. And that in Romans chapter 10, that was Israel's problem. Why can't they be saved? Because despite their zeal for Jehovah, it wasn't according to knowledge. So you can be as gung-ho as you want to and have the best of intentions, that you want to. That doesn't make it okay. And then one of the other points he makes is God's ways are always best and must be honored, as he brings out in Isaiah 55. Anything through D? Yes, sir.
There's a school of thought that I disagree with, and I don't think the Bible agrees with it. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than salvation.
Yeah.
I mean, people use that all over the world.
Yeah.
In every situation, and then try to do it in religion. But God's word does not agree with that school of thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially, you think about Paul, and a lot of times, people bring up the example of Paul. Well, Paul did it in ignorance. So as long as you don't know any better, then that makes it okay. And yet, what did Paul say in 1 Timothy chapter 1? What did he call himself? Chief of sinners. Was Paul excused just because he did it in ignorance? No, he wasn't. Okay, and so whether it's ignorance or choosing to be ignorant, which is kind of a weird statement because you really can't choose to be ignorant. It's choosing not to look into the truth. Can I be guilty of not looking at something too closely because I'm afraid that it's going to tell me something I don't want to hear? So I just ignore it? Yeah, just close your eyes and kind of pretend, or stick your head in the sand and just pretend it doesn't exist. And that makes it okay, when in fact it doesn't. Under letter E, men who oppose such a good work have unworthy motives. I haven't personally heard that one before, but certainly thinking about the connection to, as some people have claimed, even here with us, is that if we don't have a benevolent fund or some kind of system set up, program set up to help people in need in our community, we obviously don't love people. Okay, again, that's a false equivalency. They're equating love with give me stuff. Okay? And if a church is supposed to be loving, that means you have to help people with money and food and all that stuff in the community. Well, that same equivalency is being made here. Men who oppose such a good work have unworthy motives. Well, first of all, I don't know what the motives would be. Okay, everybody wants to help people. I don't think anybody's against helping people. But as it pertains to the church, I don't know if that the thought process behind that is you just want to have control, or you just want to tell people they can't, or maybe you want to use the funds for something else. Well, first of all, as Brother Cogdell brings up, okay, first of all, you can't judge a person's heart, for one thing. But second of all, if I'm opposing something on the basis that it's not authorized, okay, then what you're doing is again, the statement, it's making an equivalence between a good work and the way in which they use benevolence. And if something's not authorized, then by definition, is it a good work? Society may call it a good work, man may call it a good work, but if God doesn't call it a good work, is it one? No. No, it's not. And sometimes they equate, well, the end result is somebody is helped. And that is a good work according to God. Well, yes, that's true. Helping others, loving your neighbor, is that a good work? Yes, it is. Who's that commandment to? Individuals. Okay. To love my neighbor, that's a commandment to an individual. It is not authorized by the church as it pertains to my neighbor being an individual of the community. So there's just all kinds of stuff wrong with that particular statement. Anything else through E? All right, point 2 that he brings up, false issues that need to be eliminated. He brings the problem is not whether churches can cooperate, but how they can cooperate scripturally. And that's a great point. You use the phrase, congregations cooperating, and sometimes your mind immediately goes to the myriad examples in the religious community in which it's done in an unscriptural way. But the issue here is not whether congregations can cooperate. It's how you define cooperate. That's really the issue. And certainly he's talked about how different congregations, again, regarding the need in Jerusalem, the brethren in Antioch sent to that need in Judea, rather, in Acts chapter 12. Certainly, again, in 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, regarding the needy saints in Jerusalem. In that sense of cooperation, there is an identification of a need. That congregation who cannot take care of their individuals, or even this region of Judea that can't take care of the individuals within those congregations, they identify that need, they express that need. Other congregations and places that can help then send, according to the example of the New Testament, funds to those churches, lay it at the apostles' or at the elders' feet. They disperse those funds. There is still an order in which it has to be taken. It's not just a precedent to say we can do what we want now. Under B, the issue is not how local congregations shall, under their own elders, do their own work as to means or methods, which are matters of judgment or expediency to be worked out within the framework of the congregation itself. The issue is rather that of relationship of congregations to each other in a work for which they're equally responsible. You can undertake a concurrent work without yielding authority, without yielding oversight, and still do it within the confines of what the example of the New Testament is. To go beyond that is to go beyond the authority of the gospel. Any thoughts through A and B? Under C, it is not a question of whether or not the congregation has an obligation to care for its destitute or to preach the gospel to the lost and edify saints, but how congregations can cooperate in fulfilling their obligations to such work. And certainly that goes back to that New Testament example. But the issues here aren't about whether or not we're supposed to care for people who are in need, in desperate need in our congregation. It's not about teaching the gospel. It's not about edifying people. Those aren't the issues. The issue goes back to how much can congregations cooperate? What does that look like in the New Testament format? And then under D, he says it is not a question of the particular methods or means used in accomplishing such work. Number one, first of all, regarding benevolence, the issue is how that benevolence is shown. Okay, what form does it take? And then how far do you go with that? Again, benevolence isn't limited to just money. Okay, love is charity, or benevolence is charity, or the showing of love. Well, what form does that take in the New Testament? It takes several different forms, first of all, as congregations. But as he brings up, number two, the issue in present-day problems is what organization shall provide these necessary arrangements. And that goes back to individual autonomous congregations. Anything through point two? Point three, is it scripturally right for congregations of the Lord's church to build and maintain human organizations and to do their work through such organizations as a means of cooperating? Which is to say, the church in Jerusalem and the church at Ephesus all contribute their funds for a soup kitchen. And so the soup kitchen serves anybody in Judea who needs food, and the churches of Jerusalem and Ephesus and Philippi and whoever, they all send money to the soup kitchen, or they all send money to Jerusalem, who then uses it for a soup kitchen. It's kind of what he's describing. The point that he brings up is if we have the scriptural right to build human institutions or organizations to do some of the work for the churches, then why can't we build such organizations to do all the work of the churches? And it's a great point. As he brought up last lesson, that congregations were able to fulfill everything that they were told to do by God without the use of any such human-made organizations. There is no need for them to fulfill the commandment of God. The argument of expediency still, it doesn't ring true regarding how expediency is expressed in the authority of God. Under B, he says such a solution means the churches surrendering control over their work, and that means eventually surrendering control over the churches. And that goes back to authority, it goes back to oversight and autonomy. And in some form or fashion, when you have a system set up, somebody's going to lose control over oversight and autonomy. Okay, if you send those funds to the soup kitchen, who now controls those funds? The soup kitchen does. Okay, whether they're using them right or not. And all of a sudden, there is no direct oversight of those funds in pertaining to whatever work you're trying to accomplish there. Scriptural objections to such cooperation, and there's several here that he brings up according to the design that is given in the New Testament, the examples that were given, and all of these are things that he's brought up before in some of these past lessons as well. He brings up instrumental music earlier. And then number 4, is it scripturally right for congregations to combine their funds and centralize the control over the use of those funds in one congregation and under one eldership as a means of cooperating in accomplishing their work? He basically is just explaining what we call sponsoring church. Okay, all the different churches send money to Philippi. Philippi then sends money to Paul. That's a sponsoring church situation. Philippi being, okay, you have all these sponsoring churches sending money to Philippi. Philippi kind of acts as the head or the mother church. They send those collected funds then to Paul. And that's not the example we have, first of all, in Philippians, much less in the New Testament church. Anything through number 4? All right, and again, each one of these individual points has been brought up in other lessons as well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Also, here at the end, there's a lot of anecdotal examples that he brings up regarding some things that preachers have said or certain different denominations have done. He brings that up as examples as well. Number 5, there is a divine pattern to the organization of the church as a unique entity, as to cooperation between local churches. He brings up, of course, there's a chart. He loves these charts, and they're really cool. But he brings up the point also of that autonomy within that organization, how that's structured and how that example is given for us in the New Testament. All right, anything through 5? All right. All right, we will pick up with the questions. The second bell's just about to ring. We're going to pick up with the questions next week. For lesson 14, we'll move on to lesson 15, the church universal and the church local. Okay, this describes the broad body of Christ as a whole, the world over, versus each individual congregation that comprises the church as a whole. So we'll talk more about that with lesson 15. We've only got 2 lessons left. At the end of next class, we'll talk about some material that we could possibly bring up and look at. And if anybody has any thoughts, let me know. But in the meantime, we'll look forward to starting lesson 15 next week. Thank you, everybody.